You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your super sick with something or other host, Abraham.
And I'm your looking for a cure for something that I don't need a cure for, host Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about all of the psychology things, and periodically we'll talk about diagnoses that you'll find in the DSM or the ICD, or maybe they don't exist in either of those places, but people think of them as diagnoses. But this one does. This one does exist in both of those places, the DSM and the ICD.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that people talk about. They throw this term around a lot. I think people do this similarly to what people do with OCD. They'll be like, oh, I'm so ACD, or oh, I'm so this.
Yeah.
And the truth is you don't really know how impactful this stuff can be. So what are we talking about today, Abraham?
Yeah, of course, that means that we are talking about hypochondria and what that means. And I'm sure that even saying that conjures some feelings and thoughts and emotions in our listeners. And I'm excited to dig in because as I was looking through the research on this, I was actually very surprised at the places that this took me. And so there'll be some interesting twists and turns in here a little bit to talk about.
We ended up on WebMD a whole lot.
They spent most of our time there. Just, now we have cancer, or we think we do at least.
Yeah, we're just not going to make it for whatever reason.
Yeah, one thing or another, it's going to take us out. Anyway, if you like what we end up talking about today and you haven't already, you should subscribe, and that way you'll catch all of our future episodes. You can also support us by going out and telling a friend. You can join us on Patreon. You can pick up some merch. You can spray paint our logo all over your vehicle, all of those things, and I'll talk more about that at the end of the episode. But first, this episode is going to be released on November 30th, and there's a few holidays to talk about on November 30th. What holidays are we celebrating, Shane?
So we are celebrating the Rockefeller tree lighting, which is just, I feel like, so fun.
Yeah, it's also National Mason Jar Day, so, that's the thing.
Yeah, really great in the South. It is National Computer Security Day, so make sure that your Norton antivirus software is up to date.
Yeah. It is National Moose Day, but not M-O-O-S-E, M-O-U-S-S-E, the dessert kind of moose.
I'm glad you clarified because I was going to go watch Rocky and Bullwinkle after this.
You can still do that.
I can still do that, I guess. That's fair. While eating moose. It's also Stay Home Because You're Well Day, which is arguably the best possible day to celebrate for this episode.
Yeah, it was a happy accident that these are happening at the same time. So if you can bring a mason jar full of moose to the Rockefeller tree lighting while running software protection, then you'll be doing at least most of those holidays, or you can just stay home and watch the Rockefeller tree lighting while eating moose out of a mason jar with your VPN running. And you staying home because you're well.
Yeah, exactly. I like it. I mean, either one of those sounds great.
All right, so we are going to talk about hypochondria. I do promise. But before, I have a quick joke for you, Shane. Are you ready?
I am ready. You set this up earlier, and I'm so excited to hear the ending.
Okay, so what did one racist Nazi piece of shit say to the other racist Nazi piece of shit?
I would assume nothing good, but I don't know.
Welcome back to Twitter.
Ha! Hi-yo, got him. I love that. That's actually really good.
All right. So as we dive into this, I don't know if this is really like a PSA or something, but I think hearing this, there'll be some people who will want to self-diagnose with one of the diseases we're talking about. Maybe go see a therapist or seek treatment if you feel like you do qualify, and also maybe try to avoid self-diagnosing because that's sort of the what we're talking about. If that's helpful to do, I don't know if that's not very good advice, but I guess go talk to a professional if you are concerned.
I think anybody who's taken an abnormal psychology class has ended up self-diagnosing at some point in time, and that leads to a dangerous kind of languaging around your own health and well-being. So just if you have concerns, trust your instincts, trust your thoughts about it, and go talk to somebody who can kind of be an objective person to give you a little bit more information and insight on that.
Good points. Good points. All right, well, let's start with a little story. We're going to talk about someone named Jesse, who as a child had endured a spinal fusion surgery. And at some point during her childhood was also diagnosed with a generalized anxiety disorder.
Yeah, now later in adulthood, she described a simple experience of planting flowers when she starts to get a headache, and then she begins to having conflicting thoughts about her headache, and that's specifically from her blog about this, with a little bit of paraphrasing, but that's specifically what she's saying.
Here's a sort of dialogue she wrote about her thoughts around this headache. And again, I did paraphrase, but I lifted this pretty much straight from what she wrote. So she first thinks, what could this mean? This feels different from a normal headache. Then she reprimands herself. She says, enough. And she describes this as sort of the logic part of her mind.
Yeah. And then she thinks it could be an aneurysm or perhaps a tumor, which then she stops herself and says, do not say it. Put your gooey emotions away. They're disgusting me. Let's instead use logic. What reason is there to believe that we are having an aneurysm?
She again rationalizes, well, it's a different kind of pain, but then is immediately arguing with herself again. Oh, thank you, sweetheart, for reminding me. It's different. So it must be an aneurysm or a tumor. It couldn't possibly be a simple headache or familiar neck pain that's radiating mildly down the skull. And so she thinks to herself, if her logical mind isn't worried, then everything is probably okay.
If anybody ever gets a chance to listen to Pete Holmes stand up, he talks about how our brain is the worst because it could give us happiness and it chooses not to. And and this is one of those things, right? It's like the only person that's responsible for this is our own brains doing this to ourselves. So thank you, brains, for being this really complex, weird thing. It's not nice.
Indeed. So let's go ahead and try and define hypochondria. And what's difficult about that is that when you hear hypochondria, you might actually be thinking about one of four different things.
The first thing is a factitious disorder where, somebody might want to be sick or might want to cause injury or illness.
There, of course, is what you typically think of, which is attention seeking, simply trying to get attention for having a disease, whether or not you have it, or trying to get out of things by claiming that you have a disease.
There are somatic symptom disorders, which concern and focus on the disabling nature of symptoms, not necessarily about the concerns about them getting worse, but just kind of like, I have the symptom and so I can't do this thing, or this is how it's preventing me from living my life a certain way.
Precisely, yeah. And then finally, we have illness anxiety disorder. This is the actual name now for hypochondria. And this is perceiving significant illness from minor symptoms or even normal experiences. And I'll elaborate more on that in a moment.
Yeah, and there's also something called what they're called medically unexplained symptoms. And specifically, they persist in the bodily complaints for which the investigation does not reveal pathology or explanation. And there's also death anxiety or thanatophobia, which is the intense fear of death and dying in the dying process. So there are these kind of specific things that are going on, right? So we worry about the symptoms, we worry about investigation, not finding things, we worry about there's a lot to kind of unpack within that. There's a lot of anxieties with that.
Right. Except that with all of those disorders or diagnoses or experiences that people have, really only one of those is technically hypochondriasis or illness anxiety disorder, as it's now called. And as we said, this is actually just excessive worry that you will become seriously ill when there's only minor or even no symptoms at all. And this is kind of demonstrated in the story with Jessie that we began with, that simple experiences such as a muscle twitch, or in her case, a headache, or maybe a random spot on your skin, it leads to these just disruptive levels of anxiety about the symptom being indicative of a much more severe illness that's just looming on the horizon.
I think an operative word there is disruptive,
yes,
right?
That's very important here.
Many of us probably we might get a fever and we go, oh, we're dying. And we might do that real quick and then just kind of move past that thought because thoughts are a weird fleeting thing. But what happens here for people that have illness anxiety disorder is something will happen and it will be disruptive. It will cause financial challenges because they'll go seek remedies and they'll go to there's a lot, and we're going to kind of unpack that as we go. But I think it's important to remember that disruptive piece as kind of a hallmark for just about any diagnosis.
Yeah, basically. Exactly right. That it only merits the qualifier of diagnosis when it impedes your ability to sort of live a normal life or a life in the way that you want to live it because of some mental health thing that you're experiencing.
Yeah, so like Ron DeSantis is kind of like that.
Yeah, exactly.
He's a disorder. He's a disease because he's preventing me from living a life that I want to live.
He is a sentient, living disease.
Yeah. So if you're curious about the term hypochondria from Hippocrates,
crates full of hippos.
Good, crates full of hippos, or Hippocrates, hippo or hypo means below, and chondria means cartilage, referring to the ribs. So essentially referring to the part of the body believed to contain black bile, the buildup of which resulted in melancholia, feeling sad and discontent, all that stuff. So several philosophers and doctors over time added their own flair to hypochondria. So it basically comes from below cartilage is like kind of the original etiology of that.
Yeah, and I always thought it was weird because I felt like hypochondria, not really knowing where it came from originally, I was like, hypo usually means low, like hypoglycemic, right?
Yeah.
Or hypothyroidism as an example, like something that's performing low. And so I was like, well, this seems like something that's overactive, hyper. And that's why I was surprised, but then looked into it and it had to do with where Hippocrates, originally theorizing about this, believed that this was caused from low in your gut, below your ribs. And so that's why it was called hypochondria. Right. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and I wanted to know the etymology of that.
Yeah, it wasn't underperforming. It was specific location.
That's right. Yeah. Anyway, as you said, many people sort of added their own version to this idea of it sort of being these vapors or weird mystical things in your body. But in 1880, it wasn't until 1880 when American neurologist George Beard instead suggested that hypochondria is not caused by those vapors or bile or other mystical causes. Instead, he said that hypochondria is firmly isolated in physical and mental causes. He sort of hypothesized it was exhaustion or abuse to the brain, stomach, or of course, genitals. And of course, Freud would later agree with this, naturally.
As one does.
He called this a neurosis and agreed that that was likely what was going on.
Yeah. We had some trouble tracking down precisely when this was added to the DSM, but found suggestions that it was added in the DSM-3. So there were several revisions of the DSM and versions before it showed up. It was definitely in DSM-4 though. And so like we know for sure it was there.
Yeah. And at that point, it was called hypochondriasis or asis, maybe hypochondriasis. Then it was changed. Hypochondria was changed for the DSM-5 and is now called illness anxiety disorder. So the term hypochondria, no longer a diagnosable term. It's out. We have illness anxiety disorder, which, as we've more or less described already, is excessively worrying that you may become very ill or severely ill, even though you may have some mild symptoms or even no symptoms of a disease or illness.
I think one thing I would like to clarify here about tracking down when this was added to the DSM, it's not that there isn't a historical record of the DSM documents and all of that stuff. The problem is that diagnoses and varying symptoms and classifications change so much from the different the DSMs that it's hard to kind of pin down, because like sometimes what will happen is diagnoses will be broken up across versions. Sometimes they'll be lumped together.
Yep.
For example, like when you have Asperger's in a previous DSM and now it doesn't exist anymore in the current DSM, that kind of stuff happens. But a lot of times what it is they'll break up diagnoses and they'll turn one diagnosis into several diagnoses. And that's kind of the challenge with that.
And that's exactly what happened here. Yeah, because even before there was a DSM, this is sort of broadly lumped in with like anything related to anxiety, depression, or the broad spectrum of experiences that someone might have around all of those.
Yeah.
And so it seems like the term hypochondria was probably mostly in vogue around the time of the DSM-3, although it had been talked about prior to that. You're exactly right.
Or similar to like how people would describe somebody with like intellectual delays as being schizophrenic, or people having like, I mean, that was kind of a thing. Schizophrenia was like a catch-all for a long time.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Now, it is relatively common or relatively rare, depending on where you look, as far as hypochondria goes.
Yeah.
One comprehensive study reported that 0.1% of Americans are diagnosed with it or have it, but others reported much higher in specific populations and in other parts of the world. So kind of an interesting thing where it's prevalent but not, or it's common but not.
Yeah, it actually, I saw some wildly varying numbers across a variety of studies that looked in different places. And generally speaking, most healthcare and mental health professionals describe this as being either rare or extremely rare. But there were some places that I found that said that they felt that it was underdiagnosed or that it was much higher. So this was 0.1%. I saw up to around 0.2 or 0.3%. I even saw as high as 10%. And one place even suggested 28%. And that was in a very specific population of people that were like had a lot of risk factors for it. So the prevalence is kind of all over the map. And it was difficult to pin down like what to expect in terms of general prevalence among most people in the world. It does seem like it tends to be on the very low end, generally speaking.
Yeah.
But you know what we'll do real quick is let's go investigate. I'm going to ask everyone on the planet if they have this disorder. And while I do that, I want to run some ads. Okay, let's talk about some symptoms of what you might see and what it looks like for someone who has this illness anxiety disorder.
So when we talk about symptoms, there are a myriad of things that people experience when they have this. But one of the first ones is that there's a psychological experience severe enough to the point where the person's normal daily activity is disrupted, right? So it's getting in the way. And this could look a whole lot of different ways, right? They are spending a lot of time researching diagnoses or looking up symptoms, or they're spending a lot of time going to the doctor. Like there's a lot of things that can happen as a result of this.
Another common one that kind of makes sense is that there are someone who has this illness anxiety disorder is likely to frequently be checking their health and their body and be looking for signs of disease or illness or something else. They're sort of constantly scanning for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. The person may also be preoccupied by thoughts that symptoms may progress to more severe diseases.
Or preoccupied by thoughts that diseases will develop simply because they have a family history of that disease.
Yeah. Now, some folks are easily alarmed by health status issues. For some people who are kind of sensitive to that, you could see that kind of pop up. But people might also interpret normal bodily sensations as indicators of diseases, right? They say, okay, like I'm feeling my tummy hurts today. I've got to go get my pancreas removed.
Yeah, actually, that is a very good description of that sort of escalation. And they do describe it as escalation in some of these sources. Mm-hmm. Another important feature of this, which I've found interesting, and also it made a lot of sense to me, is that people who have this, who would receive a diagnosis for illness anxiety disorder, they're often very unsatisfied by negative tests or doctor reassurances when the doctor says either something like, this is a very normal, very mild case of like a cold, take some Robitussin or whatever, you'll feel fine.
Right.
Or even, we don't detect any symptoms, you seem to be in perfect health. And like all of these tests and everything, the person does not feel better. They don't believe it. They sort of say, no, I know there's something wrong.
Right.
There's something wrong and it's worse than it seems, is basically how they would react to that.
Right. And then they'll go further too, and they'll continue to talk about health or possible illnesses. So like that's a part of like their social interactions include these really in-depth discussions or confirmations or kind of asking. There's a lot of kind of discussion around that particular piece.
Yeah, sort of on the top of their mind, and they're recruiting a lot of sort of audience for it.
Yeah,
as a way to either just because it's something that they're thinking about a lot, or because they want to try and validate their own experiences, or just, there might be a myriad of reasons. But another thing that's important here that we've sort of alluded to is people will often avoid normal life situations because of concern that it may result in exposure to risk factors for health complications. And that is not to say, like, this is beyond normal levels of concern, such as like being worried about being attacked by alligators when you're in a swamp. That's normal. I think that's a
reasonable concern.
A life situation where you have an appropriate level of concern for the outcome of your health in a situation that's highly dangerous, or worrying about catching measles while at Disneyland, or getting brain damage from watching a Nickelback concert.
Yeah, all of those things, completely reasonable worries.
Exactly. You're in perfectly good company if those are concerns you have in those situations.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. Like, what ends up happening, and that's so disruptive because people who maybe enjoy going out or spending time in their community don't do that as much because they're worried about something that is not likely to occur.
Yeah, I guess like it's possible that it could occur, but it's sort of feeling a heightened leveling of anxiety beyond what would necessarily be entailed by the severity of the actual experience.
Right.
And it sort of brings me to, where are we likely to see this, and what groups and populations, risk factors, that sort of thing. And the information that we sort of tracked down indicated that for the most part, you're likely to see onset of this in people's 20s and 30s in terms of age ranges.
Which I think is really fascinating, that it wouldn't be for folks that are closer to shuffling off the mortal coil.
Yeah.
Like, you would think that it'd be older populations. Anyway, we could probably talk about that all the time, but I'm surprised that it's so early in people's lives.
It's probably it's the cusp of, you have some level of independence and you have to take care of yourself now and are sort of getting used to adulthood and responsibility.
Right.
And then the people who are older have been through it, and they're sort of like, well, I'm going to die anyway at some point.
Right.
And also have been through enough disease and illness that they're sort of like,
right.
It is what it is.
Yeah, it's fine.
And I could be wrong. But it feels like it's sort of in the sweet spot between I'm someone else's responsibility and they'll take care of me, and I'm now independent and have to take care of myself. And I've had enough life experience to show me how to react to this in a sort of gauged, calibrated way. That would be my that's my wild armchair speculation for you.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I was going with that too. That makes sense. Now, other people that have this are people who have experienced stressful current life events. So they have this kind of higher level of stress. So maybe they're more sensitive to these types of things, specific risk factors and all that.
A very common one I found across multiple sources and studies indicated that this was very likely in people who have a history of child abuse or trauma from illness early in life or medical problems. And again, we saw this in the example at the beginning of this discussion with Jessie, who had a spinal fusion when she was surgery when she was a child. And it seems that there's a pretty heavy or strong correlation between people who had experienced some severe medical issue early in life, and then later in life, they start to look for any sign that they're going to go through something like that again. And that actually makes a lot of sense to me. You basically have an experience that you carry with you, that there's a lot of cues associated with that are going to stand out to you more than they might someone who has not had those experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing too is that folks that have maybe some comorbidities, other people that have other mental health problems, maybe related to anxiety, OCD, personality disorders, depressions, you'll see this kind of tacked on, or this is an additional fold to their current mental health concerns.
And then continued exposure to stressful situations and environments are likely to just further exacerbate these symptoms and experiences with illness, anxiety disorder. Basically, just the more stressed out you are, the worse and more on edge you're going to feel about anything that appears to be a symptom that could be related to a disorder.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's worth probably having a conversation about how this gets treated, because we know who has it. We know some of the things that occur with it, right? The symptoms, but how does this even get treated to begin with?
Yeah, so we'll start with the fact that most of the complaints that people will have that they'll report in this tend to fall in the category of the head and neck or the chest and abdomen. And the head and neck, they're usually reporting things like experiencing headaches is really common. And then chest and abdomen, they're reporting experiences that are usually things like indigestion, constipation, or general chest, abdomen pain sort of things. And so that's where most of the complaints tend to lie.
What'll end up happening, generally, is that a doctor will try and rule out other things first to determine any physical or medical causes and pathologies. And assuming there are no physical symptoms or pathologies, the doctor will attempt to rule out other psychological concerns such as OCD or anxiety, and they'll probably get referred to a specialist, a person will.
Right.
One thing to think about this, too, and I think that's really important, is there's probably a point in time where that person doesn't end up getting referred to a specialist because just enough every now and again they're confirmed, right? They have a headache and it's an actual, there's something wrong. And so it's it's 1 out of every 100 times. Yeah. It's just enough for them to go, well, you don't need a specialist because you were actually sick.
You're right. That sort of maintains the momentum of the thing as well.
Yeah.
Now, as far as this, again, we're talking about a psychological experience. This is a mental health disorder type thing. That being said, although a lot of mental health situations are treated with pharmacological interventions, drugs are actually typically not recommended for this particular disorder.
Interesting.
Aside from antidepressants, if this is comorbid, or there are times when a psychiatrist feels that antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication will support the anxiety experience part of this, they might prescribe it. But generally speaking, pharmacological intervention is not the immediate recommended route. Instead, current recommendations largely include things like behavior therapy or behavior stress management.
Yeah, some other things they think about too are cognitive therapy. They talk about systematic desensitization and even mindfulness, meditation, relaxation training, and stuff like that. You know, this makes me think, I know I just recommended It. The character Eddie in It is textbook hypochondriac. And it starts with kind of his mom kind of like making him think that he's sick all the time. And then they talk about using a placebo, and they talk about like his inhaler in it is a placebo.
Right.
And they explain that in the book and all that. It's really interesting, but this is kind of, when you read his character views, it's very much so the experience of he's anxious. He's got a medicine cabinet full of pills, which doesn't seem to help at all. It seems to make things worse. He seems to rely on that stuff. It's really kind of fascinating. If you really want to kind of see the other side where it's untreated, it seems like a pretty good picture of that.
Interesting. That's kind of an impressively deep dive on that kind of aspect of a character for something that's somewhat niche. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I wonder if either Stephen King has experiences with this, or like really just did his research and like really wanted to describe this character as accurately as possible.
It is astounding how, like, you read it and you're like, that is it reads like it's textbook, but he carries like bottles of pills with him all the way through his adulthood.
Wow. And when was it written or published?
85.
Wow. All right. Maybe everything we've learned about this disorder actually was inspired by Stephen King's work.
That's it. Everything exists on a different level of the tower, man. That's what it is.
We wouldn't even have knowledge of it without the Dark Tower series and It.
There you go.
So we've been talking about a lot of things here. We've been talking about, risk factors for this, treatment, basic definitions, symptoms, that sort of thing. And so we have some other sort of interesting tidbits and things to break down with respect to illness, anxiety disorder. But first, you might have a pretend disease. So here is an ad for the cure. All right, so we've sort of described, I think, it set the landscape mostly for what sort of hypochondria is, but there's some other specific, unique interpretations here. We'll talk about the things that it's not, but that are related, and go a little bit in depth on those. But there's this other interesting piece I found while looking up sources about this, and one was called cyberchondria. Oh, which I know sounded kind of intriguing and in a way mildly malicious. So as recently as 2000, a journalist in the London Sunday Times described this thing called cyberchondria, and they described it as, quote, the deluded belief you suffer from all the diseases featured on the internet, end quote, which we sort of were talking about when we alluded to using WebMD for our research for this.
I just want everybody to take a second to close your eyes and think about the year 2000 and how you're probably looking up a disease on a Flash-driven website at a cjb.net website trying to figure out whether or not you have a brain tumor.
The distant future, the year 2000.
The year 2000. The title of the website is just like a spinning GIF.
Oh, right, yeah.
Or GIF. Yeah, it's great. What a time. Websites were so great in the year 2000.
They were so something.
They were so something.
That was the Wild West for sure.
Angel fire. All right, so the cyberchondria is a tendency to create a feeling of anxiety by consulting Dr. Google when you have a medical complaint and you end up going down a rabbit hole of all kinds of escalating diseases that you might have. And this is, I mean, we have all probably participated and done this at some point in time.
Yep.
But the cyberchondria part goes back to the disruptive part, right?
Yeah. And psychologists have attempted in some aspect, not necessarily consistently, but have more or less attempted to isolate cyberchondria from illness anxiety disorder by focusing on the internet search behavior as the primary concern. So it's not that there is an escalating concern from minor symptoms. It's the fact that you're essentially escalating that concern by spending your time on the internet looking up things that escalate that concern.
Right. So studies have found that 9 out of 10 people who have searched for a medical condition online ended up researching a more severe medical condition as a result. I mean, I know I have also done this. Like, not left with the information of, oh, I should go get this checked out, but more so, didn't think I would end up there, right?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of but that's also part of like my rational brain and not my flower planting headache brain telling me this is what's going on, right?
The hypochondria brain.
Yeah.
Or illness anxiety disorder brain.
Yeah.
PC term. Yeah, exactly. And the fact that I think not necessarily being able to infer the cause effect relation here, but looking at if people are looking up their symptoms and they end up on something much more severe than really makes sense given their symptoms, it's possible they could start to feel a level of anxiety about their symptoms as it relates to the disorder that they found. We don't know because they were really just looking at what did they do, and what they did was look up more severe illnesses. And you're right, I've also done this. Like, I think this is a very common thing. The people who have used the internet will be like, I have this bump on my eye, and they're like, you probably are dying right now and you have minutes to live at best.
Right.
And you're like, eye is a weird place to have a bump, but whatever. I chose body part at random and also symptom at random.
Yeah. If I have a bump on my eye, I'm going to have a lot of different concerns.
Yes. Go get that checked out immediately, please.
Yeah. If it's not a sty, right? Like, if it's not like a sty in my eyelid, that's a bump on my eye, very different concern.
All right. A related component to this idea of hypochondria is people believing that the order of the returned results from their search indicates the order of probability of the disease. Meaning that, let's say someone Googled muscle twitch because they're like have a twitchy thumb or something like that.
Yeah.
And the top result, hypothetically, let's just say they Googled muscle twitch and the top result they got was strokes that lead to death. They might then believe and sort of rationalize that stroke that leads to death is the most likely cause of muscle twitch. Now, I just made this correlation up. To the best of our knowledge, a muscle twitch is never caused by strokes that lead to death. It's usually caused by demonic possession. But
yeah, well, we know that.
Yeah.
You don't need Google to tell us.
That's right. Just kidding. But point being that like there are those who believe that the order of the search results has to do with the probability of the match. And that's just not how Google organizes their search results. Dr. Google does not care.
Nope. Exactly. Now, another thing to kind of unpack within this is factitious disorder, which we had done an entire episode on Munchausen by proxy, which is essentially factitious disorder imposed on another person. But essentially what this is factitious disorder is the desire to be actually be sick. You want to be sick. I actually saw, it was a quick news report the other day that there was a woman who identified as trans-sighted. So she made herself blind. As a result of it, she blinded herself so she could live as a blind person.
Intense,
really intense, right? What she ended up doing was pouring bleach in her eyes with the help of a therapist.
Oof.
Which is wild to me. So we'll have to probably talk about that one day. But this starts with this idea of a factitious disorder, right? You want to be sick, and this is different from illness anxiety disorder, in which the patient does not want to be sick, but is concerned that they are. What this is seeing instead is that people with factitious disorder will not only report being sick, but will often actually make themselves sick by doing things that result in physical damage or illness. They will actively make themselves sick so that they can be, versus illness anxiety disorder, which is I don't want to be, but I'm going down a really deep rabbit hole about being sick.
Yeah, they will go listen to Insane Clown Posse because they want to have mental health problems.
Yeah, of course. We know juggalos are fine people, but it's a whole thing.
We throw people under the bus, it's fun.
Yeah, that's it.
All right. Another one that we'd mentioned at the top of this was this idea of somatic symptom disorder. And again, this is much closer to illness anxiety disorder or hypochondria. But this is different because in hypochondria, the concern is that mild or no symptoms at all, maybe like a history of the potential for symptoms or being exposed to a risky situation, the fear is that will escalate into severe disease. With somatic symptom disorder instead, it's the concern that the existing symptoms are debilitating in and of themselves. So this is a minor headache that someone reports or feels, and it's like a minor headache, but they feel or report it so extreme that they just can't do anything. I just got to lay down, put an ice pack on my head, and even though it's subjectively very, very minimal, they sort of engage with it as if it were much more severe.
Right. So perhaps a muscle twitch leads to excessive complaints about the severity, about the persistence, inescapable horror. Will the nightmare ever end? That's the kind of thing that happens. So you have this experience and it tends to get magnified. Or, perhaps somebody suffers a minor burn on their foot and hobbles around in crutches and believes they are experiencing crippling destruction to their lower extremities. A one Michael Scott per se. If you happen to burn your foot on a George Foreman grill, that's the kind of thing that happens. Like, it tends to get over exaggerated.
I like the smell of bacon in the morning. Sue me.
What a great character trait of his.
Yeah.
Just he likes it so much that he just puts bacon on a George Foreman grill next to his bed.
Yeah. It was very fun. Very fun. Never comes back. It's the first time and last time it's ever mentioned, but
Yeah. It works though.
Yeah.
It's insightful.
Yeah. It was very fun. And also very believable for his character in the show. So
yeah. Right. You didn't question it. You went, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. He would do that.
I also like that he was explaining, he's like, it's nutritious, good for me. I like the smell. I don't know if that's true.
That's not true.
Okay. The last part that we mentioned at the beginning is the belief that hypochondria or illness anxiety disorder is just attention seeking. And so for most people, this is what they think of. Mm-hmm. I believe that most people use the word hypochondriac in the sort of derisive way to describe someone they believe is overblowing their symptoms because they're trying to get attention, or maybe just, they're being overly dramatic or that sort of thing. And I think that's how most people orient to it. But for people with illness anxiety disorder, that kind of interpretation actually just makes them feel worse about themselves and their symptoms and makes them less likely to seek and receive the help that they need, which for the most part is going to be psychological help, not necessarily physical help, because their symptoms are usually minor, or, medical help, but mostly that's the help that they really need. And so making them feel worse about it is not helping them get to the right place that will help them be able to react in a more productive way with respect to those symptoms.
Right. If you go back to the episode on fundamental attribution error and situations where we will maybe give somebody a label rather than looking at what they're experiencing, then you might even have doctors that get annoyed with seeing a patient multiple times and not finding anything. And then they go, oh, they're a hypochondriac. And so they might start dismissing symptoms, and it might become this whole thing where people are underdiagnosed for having illness anxiety disorder because people are just annoyed with having to talk about it or deal with it. People who are professionals, right?
Yeah.
We know the medical profession is not super always on the up and up when it comes to stuff like this, or not always accurate. So it's possible that somebody experiencing this might kind of fly under the radar because people are going, oh, it's attention seeking, and it might actually be more severe than that.
Yeah.
So there are a small handful of people who report experiencing pain or mental or physical diagnoses because they like the specific privileges of these diagnoses and what they afford, or they like the attention and concern that they get from the others. And specifically talking about the attention seeking part, not the illness anxiety disorder part.
Right.
Or they like to have their diagnosis as part of their identity, or they like the conversational element and spotlight that their diagnosis or quote unquote diagnosis gives them, or any combination of those things. So essentially, I have this illness. You give me a lot of attention. I particularly like attention from doctors or medical professionals, so I like to go do that.
Yeah.
I like to have conversations about this because this is something I know a lot about, so I like to talk about it. There's a lot of kind of contingencies to unpack within that, but a lot of it ends up with that person getting very specific attention for this thing.
Yeah, and feeling like this is who I am. I latch on to the language I have about myself in relation to this idea I have about this diagnosis. And so essentially there are a small handful of people for whom that's true. It's not most people. For most people, when we're talking about really for everyone who would actually have illness anxiety disorder, it's about the actual fear that small symptoms will escalate into more severe symptoms. For what many people think of as the attention seeking, there are some people who are doing attention seeking or that sort of version of it. But for these people, therapy is probably the best option. I'm going to give, again, sort of armchair recommendation here. This is just trying to think of this as close as possible to information that we might have available. You can try and potentially help support these people if it's attention seeking by recommending that they seek specific diagnosis by a licensed, reliable diagnostician.
Mm-hmm.
You can potentially also try showing interest in them in elements of their life that has nothing to do with their diagnosis, again, thinking this is part of their identity or their illness, and avoid trying to provide excessive attention when it comes up in conversation. So that's a dangerous game to play. You don't necessarily know where they're at. The best recommendation is probably just to help guide them to a mental health professional. But if they're one of those small number of people who are just attention seeking, it's best to just not feed into that narrative as much. We don't necessarily need to don't criticize it. We don't need to downplay it. We just want to, or like tell them that they're wrong or anything like that. Just be mindful of the fact that we also don't want to enable it, if that's what it is.
Right.
Would be my, again, this is like not an official professional recommendation, just as an idea, thinking about this in a way to help support those people. For most people, they're not attention seeking or malingering. They are actually have this illness anxiety disorder.
Right. So, Abraham, I have a question for you after all that. Like, that's a lot of information, and I want people to kind of walk away with all the information they can here. So I have a quick question for you.
Shoot.
What does malingering mean?
That's a very good inquisitor voice. Yeah, malingering is essentially people who will pretend to be sick or ill, or they'll exaggerate their symptoms of sickness or illness, specifically for the express purpose of escaping obligations such as work and that sort of thing. So that's what malingering is. And then that's not the case for most of the people we've been describing as having illness anxiety disorder.
Yeah, malingering is often, I hear it used more in like military contexts, where people might kind of express something to get out of duty or to get out of contracts and stuff like that. So,
well, we're about to play an ad. You can use this ad to time how long you should wash your hands, unless you're listening on times 2 speed, and then listen to it twice. Okay, let's do some quick take-home points here on our discussion about illness anxiety disorder. I think, for one, my main take-home point for this is that this is actually a real thing. It's in the DSM, and it is the experience that people have that they will react to small or no symptoms or risk of exposure to risky situations as meaning that they're on a path toward a like severe illness or disease, and that engaging with that reaction to it will inhibit a normal sort of fruitful life because they're pursuing that so fully, and they'll avoid social situations. It'll be the dominant part of their conversation when it happens. They will not accept medical diagnoses that do not confirm their beliefs in this thing. That's, I think, the big take-home point, is that that's what this actually looks like in sort of practice, if you will.
Yeah, and I think another one I would have here is just more some general advice. If you know somebody who's experiencing this, just to be compassionate, because if we are talking about somebody who is struggling with thoughts around potentially fatal medical disorders or diagnoses, then they're probably already really struggling.
Yeah.
So it doesn't help to call somebody attention seeking and kind of make them feel bad about that, because it may do a couple things. It may prevent them from seeking help when they need to. It may exacerbate other diagnoses they have, depression, anxiety. It might kind of isolate them from social circles. So just be compassionate and provide some guidance on where to get that professional help if they need that, because I think that it's very easy to write somebody off as being attention seeking, and the truth is they may be having some really significant impacts from this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that's pretty much all that I have for take-home points. I feel like that you captured exactly the other thing I probably would have said. So that feels good to me. Do you have anything else to add there?
No, I got nothing else. I mean, I think it's super fascinating. Yeah, I think I don't have anything else.
Okay. Hypochondria, not just your attention-seeking step-sibling who is weird about their headaches or muscle twitches or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Not representative of your Google search.
Definitely not that. All right. Well, I have some recommendations. Do you?
I also have recommendations. Recommendations. So my recommendation is a scary one.
Ooh.
I'm just going to say it right now. This is not a recommendation for everybody. If you are somebody who likes metal and you like death metal and you like scary metal, this is an album that I've recently gotten into again. I've revisited it, and it's really great. And it's an album from a band called Carcass.
Okay.
And the album is called Heartwork.
Okay.
So this is considered like a seminal record in like the melodic death metal kind of genre, which I'm not going to, for those of you who are listening who are into this, I'm not going to get into all the nuances of death metal versus melodic death metal versus gore death metal versus grindcore. Like they called themselves at one point in time, they called themselves hardcore instead of hardcore. Not going to do that. It's bonkers. Okay. They are a band from the UK.
Okay.
They are scary and loud and very metal. It is like textbook metal, but they are known for being, some people will say they're like medically accurate gore grind.
Okay.
Is a way to say it. It doesn't matter. If you like metal, it's just a good metal listen. The guy's voice, he can do like the real low death metal growls, the real high voices. The musicianship is incredible. The drummer is fantastic. It's just a really great record if you like metal.
All right.
Like metal, not like the metal that like we kind of grew up with in like the early 2000s. It was like hardcore and punk influenced metal. This is like straight up like take themselves very seriously metal.
Okay.
So
not like Slipknot.
Yeah, no. They take themselves way more seriously. Yeah. Like this band would tour with Slayer and they would be like, okay, that's like that genre.
When I think of textbook metal, I think of aluminum because yes,
of course. Yeah, of course. As one does.
All right. I'm recommending a food. Specifically, I'm recommending my favorite food is probably mushrooms.
Mm-hmm.
I pretty much have liked every mushroom I've ever tried. And the mushrooms I'm recommending today are called Maitake mushrooms, also called hen of the woods.
So fancy.
How to describe them? I think they're called hen of the woods because they almost look kind of feathery in a way. Like they have kind of thin mushrooms that overlap each other and that look really neat.
Mm-hmm.
Or like, I don't know what you call them, petals or fronds or something. I don't know. But they have this almost feathery look and kind of like a bunch. They come out, but I love them. I think they have one of the best flavors of mushrooms. They're really, really good. You probably are only going to find them at grocery stores that carry a lot of varieties of mushrooms, or you'll find them dried in certain sections of the grocery store that carries like dried mushrooms, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, Maitake mushrooms are big up there for me. A lot of people don't like mushrooms because of the texture. These ones do kind of have a mushroomy texture, but not like you're probably used to with the like normal criminy mushrooms.
Mm-hmm.
These are a little bit softer than that, so it's not as chewy. So if that's a thing for people,
okay,
maybe check these ones out. But I love mushrooms, and these are one of my favorite kinds.
Mushrooms are delicious. I think they get a bad rap.
I think so too. Go check out some mushrooms.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you'd like to tell us about a straight up very serious metal band or your favorite type of mushroom, you should definitely reach out to us. If you'd like to tell us about your experiences with illness, anxiety disorder, hypochondria, or anything related to something we talked about in this episode, we would absolutely love to hear from you. Reach out to us. You can email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com. You can also reach out to us on the social media platforms that are not alt-right hate speech platforms. We're on the normal ones, not MySpace, but most of the other normal ones.
We could be on MySpace.
If we are, I don't know about it, but that's maybe we'll start a profile there and try and bring it back around or something. Apparently, the world needs more social media sites. Just more. There's not a limit. Just more. So anyway, that's where we find ourselves. And you can reach out to us on those places. We, as I said, would like to hear from you about all of those things. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a Patreon member. In so doing, you can access to our notes, which often have stuff that we did not include in the recording, or pictures and references and that sort of thing. You can get access to our behind-the-scenes content, recorded videos, unedited episodes, all kind of fun stuff like that. And plus, it helps us out. It helps us do the thing that we like to do and that we have so much fun doing.
That's true.
But I understand that's not really on people's sort of in their budget or on their radar, something that they want to do. If you want to just like support us just a little bit, you can head over to our merch store and maybe pick up a mug or a sweater, shirt, water bottle, sticker patch, hat, beanie, all kinds of things you can have there.
Yeah. Please support anything you can do.
For some of those things, you get a personalized package directly from Shane.
That's true.
I'm not going to tell you which. You just have to buy them all, and one of them will come with a love letter that Shane wrote for you.
Surprise. That's true. Maybe even a picture.
sort of enlisting Shane right now in the moment in this endeavor. So anyway, you can head over to our merch store and do that.
I'm fine with that.
You know what? I've never done this before. Maybe we'll do some Black Friday deals or something fun like that on our merch, just to throw it out there.
I saw somebody do, they're doing like anti-Black Friday deals. So like they're doing it to like curb the culture of Black Friday and like get people shopping not on that day. So like I thought that was pretty cool. So maybe we'll do something like that.
Okay. Maybe just a Thanksgiving day or some other day or something. I don't know.
Like a holiday special.
Yeah, holiday special. That's a good way to put it. Anyway, I would like to thank the people who have already joined us on Patreon that help make this little work that we do possible. That includes Amanda, Brad, The Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kelly, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. You guys are the bee's knees. Thank you for what you do. Also, I am remiss in the fact that we have been supported in part by the Disseminating Behavior Analysis SIG for basically this entire year, and I need to go back and re-record some things that we can tag onto those episodes to show our support for all the help that they have done for us. And thank you. You're very wonderful. You're the best.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, thank you so much for my team of people without whom I also could not do this little shindig, and that includes Justin, Alan, Jess, and Patrick, and then, of course, Shane. I almost didn't include you because I wanted to say you last because you're here with me now. Thank you so much for all the work that you do and for recording with me today.
And thank you for letting me record with you. It's so wonderful.
And then, of course, thanks to all the listeners. There's like 3 groups of people without whom I would not have a podcast. All y'all do the thing, and you're all the best. So thank you so much for letting us have our little show and have fun with it. I think that is all that I have. Am I missing anything?
No, I think that covers it.
All right. Well, then that's all I've got. Thanks for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.